My name is Caroline, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a top-tier firm. At my 20th birthday party, I quietly transferred my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance from my grandparents into a blind trust, just as a precaution. 13 years later, at our family Thanksgiving dinner, my parents and younger sister shoved a $50,000 check in my face. They bragged that they had just sold my land for $15 million behind my back. They demanded my gratitude and mocked my career. They had no idea the documents they signed to sell that land were completely worthless, and that their arrogance was about to trigger a massive federal fraud investigation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to silently outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. Growing up in our household was like living on a movie set where the cameras were always rolling, but the budget was entirely built on credit. My mother Cynthia, who is 58, and my father Edward, who is 60, cared about one thing and one thing only, which was high society status. They were the kind of people who would lease a luxury car they could not afford just to make sure the neighbors saw it parked in the driveway. My younger sister Brittany, who is 30, absorbed this toxic mindset perfectly. She grew up as their golden child, entirely entitled, deeply superficial, and always ready to play the victim if anyone dared to tell her no. I was the family disappointment because I preferred studying financial law over attending country club mixers. When my grandparents passed away, they bypassed my parents completely and left their prime warehouse district real estate directly to me. My parents never forgave me for that. This Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a standard display of their fake wealth. I arrived at my parents' sprawling Beacon Hill mansion bracing myself for the usual passive-aggressive comments. The dining room was decorated to an absurd degree with towering floral centerpieces and crystal glasses that caught the light of the chandelier. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage stuffing filled the air, but the atmosphere was thick with an unusual tense excitement. I sat quietly at the table observing the performance. My mother Cynthia was holding court at the head of the table, wearing a designer gown that was entirely too formal for a family dinner. My father Edward was pouring expensive wine, boasting about his real estate connections to anyone who would listen. They kept exchanging knowing smirks across the table. Then the front door opened and Brittany walked in hand with her husband Terrence. Terrence is 32 years old, a tall and striking African-American man who loved playing the role of the ultimate finance guru. He ran what he called an exclusive hedge fund, but whenever I asked him basic questions about his investment strategies, he would deflect with empty corporate buzzwords and accuse me of not understanding visionary business. Tonight, Terrence and Brittany were practically vibrating with smug energy. Terrence strutted into the dining room and tossed a heavy set of keys onto the mahogany dining table with a loud clatter. It was a brand new shiny Porsche key fob. Brittany squealed at the top of her lungs, tossing her arms around Terrence. She announced to the entire room that her brilliant husband had just surprised her with her absolute dream car to celebrate a massive new financial breakthrough for his company. I took a slow sip of my water, waiting for the inevitable punchline. Cynthia clapped her hands together, silencing the room with a theatrical smile. She reached into her expensive designer clutch and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. She walked purposefully over to where I was sitting and dropped it right onto my dinner plate, right on top of my napkin. I looked down. It was a certified cashier check made out to me for exactly $50,000. I looked at the check and then slowly looked up at my mother. I asked her in a perfectly level voice what this was supposed to be. Cynthia smiled down at me with an expression of supreme, unadulterated arrogance. She placed her hands on her hips and announced to the entire dining room that she and my father had finally done me a massive favor. She explained in a loud, boasting tone that they had just finalized the sale of the old warehouse district land. That was the prime real estate my grandparents had explicitly left only to me, bypassing my parents completely because they knew Edward and Cynthia would squander it. According to my mother, the land was just sitting there, gathering dust. So she and my father stepped in, took control, and finalized a massive corporate buyout with Vanguard Corporation. She proudly declared that they had sold my inheritance for a staggering $15 million. She pointed at the check on my plate and told me to take my $50,000 allowance and be grateful. She actually looked me in the eyes and said I should thank them because I did not understand real business, and I never would have known what to do with a multi-million-dollar commercial property anyway. She stood there waiting for me to bow down and worship her financial genius. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. They had actively gone behind my back, forged whatever legal documents they needed, and sold a massive piece of commercial real estate that legally belonged to me. Now they fully expected me to fall to my knees and thank them for throwing a tiny microscopic fraction of the payout my way. I looked down at the $50,000 check resting against the fine china. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my glass or flip the table. In my line of work, you do not react to a massive financial fraud with emotion. You react with cold, hard evidence. I sat perfectly still, letting their arrogant laughter and self-congratulations wash over the room. I knew something they did not. I knew that the power of attorney document my father possessed had expired over a decade ago. I knew that the signature they used to authorize the Vanguard deal was a complete forgery. I knew they had just committed a massive federal felony, and they had just handed me the ultimate written confession on a silver platter. I simply took another calm sip of my water, staring at the forged check, feeling a profound sense of cold clarity. They thought they had outsmarted the quiet daughter, but they were about to learn a brutal lesson in federal law. The belittlement started immediately after the check hit my plate. My family operated like a pack of starving wolves sensing blood in the water, and my silence was all the invitation they needed to pile on the insults. Brittany leaned across the table, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking obnoxiously against the polished wood. She laughed a high-pitched, mocking sound and told me I should use the $50,000 to finally buy some decent clothes or maybe take a vacation from my depressing spreadsheet life. She openly mocked my career as a forensic accountant, calling me a mindless corporate drone who just stares at a computer screen all day. She boasted that while I was busy punching numbers into a calculator, real entrepreneurs like her husband were out making the big moves and securing generational wealth. She actually said it was a blessing that our parents stepped in to manage the family assets because I would have just let that incredibly valuable land sit there collecting dust and property taxes until I went bankrupt. My father, Edward, nodded enthusiastically while violently slicing into the roasted turkey. He pointed his carving knife directly at my face and added that they had to take matters into their own hands because I completely lacked the aggressive shark mentality needed for true wealth accumulation. He explained that the warehouse district was gentrifying rapidly and Vanguard Corporation was absolutely desperate to acquire the land to build a massive new commercial shopping complex. He puffed out his chest and boasted about how he aggressively negotiated the massive $15 million payout, claiming his tactics were a masterclass in high-stakes commercial real estate. According to him, leaving that property in my name would have been a catastrophic waste of potential. He genuinely believed he was a brilliant titan of industry for forging legal documents to steal a fortune from his own daughter. Then Terrence decided it was his turn to take center stage and assert his dominance. He dramatically adjusted his expensive gold watch and leaned back in his dining chair with a sickeningly smug grin on his face. He proudly announced to the room that Edward and Cynthia were not just keeping the rest of the $15 million in a boring, low-yield savings account. Instead, they were pumping the entire fortune directly into his exclusive private investment fund. Terrence bragged that with his visionary market strategies and unparalleled financial intellect, he was going to take that $15 million and multiply it by 10 within the next 5 years. He promised my parents private jets, luxury vacation homes in the south of France, and a level of elite, untouchable wealth that most people could only dream of. He looked at me with absolute dripping condescension and generously offered to let me invest my little $50,000 check into his fund. He said he would do me a favor and waive his usual management fees just so I could finally experience what real wealth felt like. I sat there listening to this absolute circus of financial delusion. My mind was automatically running the numbers and analyzing the sheer volume of criminal liability floating around the dining room table. Terrence was openly promising a guaranteed 1,000% return on investment, which is a textbook glaring red flag for a Ponzi scheme. My father was loudly bragging about negotiating a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate transaction using fraudulent authorization and identity theft. My mother was treating $50,000 of my own money like a generous charitable donation for my forced cooperation. They were completely intoxicated by their own greed and their perceived superiority over me. They had absolutely no idea how deep the grave they had dug for themselves truly was. Brittany pulled out her phone and started recording a live video for her social media followers. She flashed her brand new Porsche keys at the camera and panned the lens over the luxurious Thanksgiving spread. She loudly narrated to her audience that her brilliant husband had just secured a massive 8-figure deal and that their lives were about to ascend to a whole new tax bracket. She deliberately made sure to angle the camera to catch me sitting quietly at the end of the table, painting a pathetic picture of the sad, jealous older sister who was just passively witnessing their fabulous success. She blew an exaggerated kiss to the camera and talked about how blessed she was to be married to a financial genius who knew how to build a real empire. Every single word they spoke, every cruel insult they threw at my career, every arrogant boast about their stolen new wealth was simply adding more fuel to the fire that was about to consume them completely. I looked closely at Terrence, who was currently delivering a loud, passionate speech about overcoming obstacles as a Black business owner and building a lasting legacy for his future children. It was utterly repulsive how he constantly weaponized social justice issues and his race to shield himself from basic financial scrutiny. He used these progressive buzzwords to dazzle my parents, who were so desperately eager to appear culturally aware and wealthy that they blindly handed over $15 million without ever seeing a single audited financial statement or prospectus from his firm. They were the absolute perfect marks for a charming, confident grifter. I picked up the cashier check by the corner, holding it up to the warm light of the chandelier above us. I meticulously examined the watermarks, the printed routing numbers, and the authorized signature. It was a legitimate certified check drawn from an account that had likely received the initial good faith escrow deposit from Vanguard Corporation. They truly believed they had won the ultimate prize. They truly believed that because I had always been the quiet, responsible, and compliant daughter, I would simply accept this blatant theft and walk away with my tiny allowance while they lived like royalty on my grandparents' legacy. They fatally mistook my silence for submission, when in reality, it was just the quiet, intense focus of a forensic auditor gathering the final pieces of evidence for a federal indictment. My mother, Cynthia, raised her crystal wine glass, calling for a toast to family prosperity and bold financial moves. Edward, Terrence, and Brittany all raised their glasses high, cheering loudly and congratulating themselves on pulling off the ultimate heist. I did not touch my glass. I gently placed the check back onto the table and slid it precisely to the exact center where everyone could see it. I folded my hands together, resting them on the table, and looked directly into my mother's eyes. The dining room slowly went completely quiet as they noticed my absolute lack of compliance. They expected tears or anger or desperate pleading. Instead, they got the cold, calculating, and merciless stare of a forensic accountant who had just caught them committing the biggest financial crime of their entire lives. I took a deep, steadying breath, entirely ready to drop the truth that would shatter their fake reality and turn their luxurious Thanksgiving dinner into an active federal crime scene. I broke the suffocating silence by extending my right index finger and sliding the $50,000 check back across the silk tablecloth. It stopped exactly an inch away from my mother's crystal wine glass. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms and looking at the people who were supposed to be my family. "I am not taking your allowance, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. And you are not selling the warehouse district to Vanguard Corporation. In fact, you have not sold anything at all. Brittany let out a loud dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes and setting her phone face down on the table. Terrence chuckled, shaking his head like he was dealing with an irrational toddler. Caroline, come on now, Terrence scoffed. Do not embarrass yourself. The deal is closed. The ink is dry on the contract. Edward and Cynthia already signed the transfer deed. It is done. Now be a good sister, take your little payout, and let the adults handle the real capital. I ignored Terrence completely. I kept my eyes locked onto my father. Edward was gripping his silver carving knife tightly, his knuckles turning a stark white. You used the power of attorney document I signed when I was 18. Did you not? Dad, I stated as a matter of fact, rather than a question. The one you convinced me to sign right before I went backpacking through Europe, claiming you just needed it to manage the property taxes while I was out of the country. Edward cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep defensive crimson. As the patriarch of this family, it is my absolute legal right to manage our generational assets. You were doing nothing with that warehouse district. Vanguard offered $15 million. I made a strategic executive decision to execute the sale on your behalf. It is completely legal. It would have been legal, I replied, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register, if that document had not expired exactly a decade ago. The color instantly drained from my mother's face. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the mahogany wood. What are you talking about? Cynthia demanded, her voice cracking slightly. We had the family lawyer look at it. The power of attorney was perfectly valid. I fired the family lawyer the second I turned 20, I stated, watching the pure terror begin to dawn in their eyes. I realized very early on that you two were burning through cash faster than you could earn it. I saw the remortgages on this house. I saw the massive credit card debt you actively hid behind country club memberships. I knew it was only a matter of time before you tried to liquidate my inheritance to fund your lavish lifestyle. So for my 20th birthday, I did what any competent forensic accountant in training would do. I hired an independent corporate attorney and I quietly transferred the entire warehouse property into an irrevocable blind trust. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. You do not own that land. I do not even own that land on paper anymore. A heavily guarded corporate trust owns it. The trustee is a merciless financial firm in Delaware, which means the transfer deed you just signed and handed over to Vanguard Corporation's legal team is completely, entirely, and unequivocally fraudulent. You are lying, Brittany shrieked, slamming her hands on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. You are just making this up because you are jealous of Terrence and his success. You cannot stand that we have a brand new Porsche and you have nothing. I do not need a Porsche, Brittany, I replied coldly, because I am not the one driving a car financed by stolen funds. You have no idea what is actually happening right now. I turned my attention back to my father, who was now sweating profusely. His arrogant demeanor was rapidly dissolving into sheer panic. You took an expired, revoked power of attorney, and you presented it to a multi-billion-dollar corporation as a valid legal instrument. You signed a transfer deed attesting under penalty of perjury that you had the legal right to sell an asset that is locked inside an irrevocable trust. You didn't sell anything. You committed felony document forgery. I still hold the deed. Terrence finally stopped smirking. His aggressive, confident posture melted away as the financial reality of my words hit him. He was a grifter, but he knew enough about corporate law to understand what a blind trust meant for his payout. Wait, Terrence stammered, looking frantically at Edward. Did you actually verify the title before you signed the contract with Vanguard? I am her father, Edward roared desperately, trying to maintain his crumbling authority. I am on her birth certificate. I do not need to verify a title on land that has been in my family for generations. The lawyer said it was fine. Your lawyer said it was fine because you explicitly lied to them, I corrected him sharply. You deliberately withheld the fact that the property was legally transferred years ago. You committed fraud by inducement. Vanguard Corporation is a publicly traded entity. When they transfer $15 million for a commercial real estate acquisition, they are required to report it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You just triggered a major federal event. Cynthia grabbed her chest, hyperventilating as she stumbled back from the dining table. You planned this, she gasped, pointing at me with a trembling manicured finger. You sat there all these years letting us pay for dinners, letting us invite you to our home, just waiting to destroy your own family. You never took care of me, Mother, I said calmly, standing up from my chair and picking up my coat. You threw me to the wolves the moment I refused to be a trophy daughter. You tried to sell my future to fund your fake lifestyle. I did not destroy this family. I just handed you the rope and you tied the knot yourselves. I looked around the lavish dining room, taking in the towering floral arrangements and the crystal glasses that were supposed to be a celebration of their ultimate heist. Instead, it had become the exact site of their absolute ruin. The air was thick with the suffocating realization that their entire house of cards had just been blown away by a single undeniable legal fact. Edward collapsed back into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the $50,000 check that still sat in the middle of the table. That tiny piece of paper was no longer a symbol of his aggressive business prowess. It was the physical evidence of his impending federal indictment. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a tantrum to make them understand the gravity of their situation. The silence in the room spoke volumes. Before anyone could formulate another pathetic excuse, the sharp trill of a cell phone shattered the quiet. It was not just a generic ringtone. It was the specific aggressive chime Edward assigned to his most important business contacts. The caller identification flashed brightly on the mahogany table right next to his half-empty wineglass. The screen displayed Vanguard Corporation Legal Department in bold, harsh letters. Edward stared at the glowing screen as if a venomous snake had just uncoiled on his dinner plate. His chest heaved and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple, completely ruining his carefully styled silver hair. "Pick it up, Dad," I suggested, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. "It is incredibly rude to keep a multi-billion-dollar acquisition team waiting on Thanksgiving. They probably just want to wish you a happy holiday." With trembling fingers, he grabbed the device and pressed it to his ear. "Hello, Edward," said his booming patriarchal voice, suddenly reduced to a weak, pathetic rasp. He listened. We all watched as the remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted wildly around the opulent dining room, seeking an escape that did not exist. "No, there must be a misunderstanding," he stammered into the phone, gripping the edge of the table for physical support. "What do you mean the title search failed? The escrow account cannot be frozen. I am the authorized signer on that deed. I demand to speak to your Vice President of Acquisitions immediately." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. The representative from Vanguard was clearly not in a festive mood. Whatever they were saying made Edward physically shrink into his chair, his broad shoulders collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. "Federal authorities." Edward gasped out loud, his voice cracking in terror. "No, listen to me. We can clear this up privately. Just give me 24 hours to produce the correct documentation. I will have my daughter sign a quitclaim deed tomorrow morning. I can fix this." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Good luck getting a signature from a blind trust administrator in Delaware," I said loud enough for the Vanguard lawyers to hear through the receiver. The line abruptly went dead. Edward slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly at the dark screen. His mouth hung open in absolute shock. "Edward," Cynthia asked, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Edward, what did they say? Where is our $15 million? Edward looked at his wife, then at Terrence, and finally at me. "Vanguard ran the final title search," he whispered, sounding like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. "They found the blind trust. The escrow account has been completely frozen by their legal team. They are reporting the transaction to their internal fraud division. The payout is canceled." "No!" Brittany screamed, jumping up from her chair. Her elbow caught her crystal wine glass, sending it crashing to the floor. The glass shattered into 100 pieces, and dark red wine splashed across my mother's imported Persian rug, looking remarkably like fresh blood. "Terrence already promised the investors. We already bought the car. We already booked the flights to Monaco for the holidays. Fix it, Dad. Fix it right now. I cannot fix it! Edward roared, finally losing his temper and slamming his fist onto the table, causing the expensive china plates to jump. She trapped us. Vanguard is threatening to file a report with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for multi-million-dollar wire fraud. They said my signature on that transfer deed constitutes a felony. Terrence jumped up his chair, crashing to the floor behind him. His charismatic, confident persona vanished instantly, replaced by the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered criminal. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. You sign that trust over to us right now, Caroline. You call that trustee in Delaware and you sign it over, or I swear to God I will make you regret it. You are ruining my business. Or you will do what Terrence I asked, completely unfazed by his pathetic physical posturing. You will sue me. You will call the police. Please call them. Let us get the authorities in here right now so we can discuss the missing capital from your so-called elite hedge fund. Let us discuss why you desperately needed my $15 million to bail out your older investors before they realized their retirement accounts were completely empty. Let us talk about your unregistered Ponzi scheme. Terrence froze, his jaw dropping. The aggression completely left his body, replaced by raw, visceral fear. He looked at Edward, who was too consumed by his own legal nightmare to process what I had just said. Terrence knew I was a forensic accountant, but he had arrogantly assumed I was too boring to look into his brilliant ventures. He now realized I possessed the exact skills required to dismantle his entire fake empire, and I already had the data. Cynthia grabbed her chest, hyperventilating as she stumbled back from the dining table. You planned this, she gasped, pointing at me with a trembling, manicured finger. You sat there all these years letting us pay for dinners, letting us invite you to our home, just waiting to destroy your own family. You are a monster, Caroline. You never took care of me, Mother, I said calmly, standing up from my chair and picking up my tailored wool coat from the back of the seat. You threw me to the wolves the moment I refused to be a trophy daughter. You tried to sell my future to fund your fake lifestyle. I did not destroy this family. I just handed you the rope and you tied the exact knot yourselves. I buttoned my coat, looking around the lavish dining room one last time, taking in the towering floral arrangements, the crystal glasses, the shattered wine glass on the floor, and the $50,000 check still sitting uselessly on the table. It was supposed to be a celebration of their ultimate heist. Instead, it had become the exact site of their absolute ruin. The air was thick with the suffocating realization that their entire house of cards had just been blown away by a single undeniable legal fact. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on the screaming, chaotic mess of a family dinner and walked confidently toward the heavy oak front doors. Behind me, I could hear Brittany sobbing hysterically about her car, Terrence yelling at Edward to do something, and my mother wailing about her ruined social status and the impending police investigation. It was a symphony of destruction, and I had orchestrated every single note perfectly. As I stepped out into the crisp, cool November air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Dominic, my fiancé, asking if dinner was done. I smiled, breathing in the fresh evening air. The turkey was dry, I texted back, but the dessert was incredibly sweet. Let us get to work. I got into my car and drove away from the Beacon Hill mansion, leaving my parents and my sister to drown in the shallow, fraudulent grave they had spent their entire lives digging. They wanted $15 million. Instead, they were getting a front-row seat to federal prosecution. The morning after Thanksgiving did not begin with leftover turkey or lazy holiday shopping. It began exactly at 6 in the morning, with the harsh buzzing of my cell phone vibrating against the marble kitchen island of my downtown apartment. I was already awake, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and pouring a cup of black coffee. Dominic stood across from me, leaning against the counter in his own crisp dress shirt, reviewing a stack of corporate litigation files. We had been up since 4, analyzing the preliminary digital footprint of the fraudulent transfer my father had attempted. We were preparing for a war, and in our professions, war was waged with ink and bank routing numbers. The caller identification on my phone flashed brightly, displaying my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, observing the screen with absolute detachment. Narcissists always follow a highly predictable behavioral pattern when they are caught in a lie. First comes the aggressive denial, then the shifting of blame, and finally the desperate emotional blackmail. Last night was the denial. This morning was the blackmail phase. I tapped the screen answering the call and immediately placed it on speakerphone so Dominic could bear witness to the incoming manipulation. "Caroline, how could you possibly sleep last night?" Cynthia shrieked into the phone, her voice shrill and dripping with manufactured hysteria. I could hear the forced, jagged breathing she was using to simulate a panic attack. "Your father has been awake all night, pacing the floor, holding his chest. He is having severe heart palpitations because of what you did to him. You are sending your own father to an early grave." I took a slow, calm sip of my coffee. "I did not do anything to his heart, Mother," I replied, my voice completely level. I simply informed him that his attempt to commit federal document forgery was unsuccessful. If he is experiencing cardiac distress, I highly suggest you call an ambulance instead of calling the daughter he just tried to steal $15 million from." "How dare you speak to me like that?" Cynthia wailed abruptly, switching from the fragile victim to the indignant matriarch. "We did not steal anything from you. We were protecting you. We were stepping in to manage a highly complex commercial real estate transaction because you are just a desk worker who does not understand how the real world operates. We were trying to elevate the entire family to a new level of wealth, and you maliciously set a trap to humiliate us. You are a cold-blooded monster, Caroline." Dominic raised an eyebrow at the phrase cold-blooded monster. He pulled a pen from his pocket and started taking shorthand notes on a legal pad, documenting her exact admissions. I watched his pen glide across the paper, feeling entirely grounded. Years ago, her screaming would have made my stomach twist into knots of guilt. I would have scrambled to apologize, to make myself smaller, to fix whatever perceived slight I had committed against her fragile ego. But today, her words held absolutely zero power over me. They were just empty, desperate noises from a woman who realized her luxury lifestyle was about to be repossessed by the federal government. "You can try to rewrite the narrative all you want, Mother," I stated firmly. "But Vanguard Corporation does not care about your feelings or your social status. They only care about the title defect on a multi-million-dollar acquisition. They know Edward signed a transfer deed he had zero legal authority to sign. They know he presented an expired power of attorney. You can call me a monster, but that does not change the fact that you two committed fraud by inducement." Cynthia let out a loud, dramatic sob, clearly realizing her aggressive tactics were failing against my logical responses. "Caroline, please," she begged, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, pleading tone. "You have to fix this. You have to save the family. Vanguard Legal is calling your father again this morning, demanding answers. They are threatening to involve the authorities by noon if we do not produce the correct paperwork." She paused, taking a deep, ragged breath before delivering her ultimate demand. "You need to call that trust administrator in Delaware right now. You need to dissolve the blind trust and sign the property deed over to your father. We can backdate the authorization documents. It is just a simple signature, Caroline. Just one signature, and all of this goes away. Terrence can proceed with his investment fund. Brittany can keep her car, and your father stays out of federal prison. You owe us this. We raised you. We gave you everything. Save the family, Caroline." I stared at the phone, listening to the sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from the speaker. She was actively asking me to participate in a massive cover-up, to backdate legal documents, and to willingly hand over my entire inheritance to a man running an unregistered Ponzi scheme. She wanted me to become a criminal accomplice, just so she could keep sipping champagne at her country club galas. I looked at Dominic, who shook his head in absolute disbelief at her brazen request. I leaned closer to the phone, making sure my voice would carry through the speaker with crystal-clear precision. "Let me explain exactly how this works, Mother," I said slowly, articulating every single syllable. "I am a licensed forensic accountant. I uncover corporate fraud for a living. I do not participate in it. I am not going to call Delaware. I am not going to dissolve the trust. I am certainly not going to backdate any legal documents to cover up your felony. You tried to sell my future to fund a fraudulent lifestyle and you failed. Now you get to face the consequences. Caroline, if you do not sign those papers, you are dead to me. Cynthia screamed, her voice tearing with genuine rage. You will have no family left. We will ruin you. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. No, I replied flatly. I reached out and ended the call, cutting off her hysterical screaming mid-sentence. The kitchen fell into a beautiful, peaceful silence. I picked up my coffee mug and took another sip. Dominic smiled, picking up his legal pad and sliding it into his briefcase. He looked at me with total professional admiration. That was textbook coercion and attempted witness tampering, he noted smoothly. Your mother is remarkably efficient at digging her own grave. I nodded, setting my mug down on the marble counter. She thinks she can bully me into submission, I said, grabbing my own briefcase. But she is about to realize that the digital trail Terrence left behind is far more dangerous than anything I could ever say to her. I knew the emotional blackmail was just their opening move. When narcissists fail to control you directly, they immediately try to control how other people perceive you. My mother and father had failed to force my signature, which meant the next attack would not come from them. It would come from the golden child. Brittany was about to weaponize her internet following to try and destroy my reputation, but I was already 10 steps ahead of her. By the time Dominic and I walked into the sleek glass lobby of my accounting firm, my phone was vibrating continuously against my palm. The notifications were not coming from my mother or my father. They were coming from thousands of strangers. I opened my social media applications as the elevator carried us up to the executive suite. My notification feed was an endless scrolling waterfall of absolute vitriol. My younger sister Brittany had exactly 200,000 followers online, and she had just unleashed every single one of them directly onto my professional and personal profiles. I clicked on the link that several anonymous accounts had angrily tagged me in. It directed me straight to an Instagram live broadcast that Brittany had posted just an hour ago. I tapped the screen and watched my sister's performance with the clinical fascination of a predator observing its prey. Brittany had perfectly staged the entire video to maximize emotional manipulation. She was sitting on the plush velvet sofa in our parents' Beacon Hill mansion, wearing an oversized beige sweater to look small and vulnerable. Her makeup was deliberately smudged under her eyes to simulate hours of endless crying. Terrence sat right beside her, looking stoic and deeply oppressed, resting his hand protectively over hers. Brittany stared directly into the camera lens with wide, tear-filled eyes and began her monologue. She told her massive audience that her heart was completely shattered because her own flesh and blood had just betrayed her. She openly named me. She pointed her finger at the camera and told the internet that her older sister Caroline was a bitter, jealous, and deeply racist individual. Brittany claimed that Terrence had spent years building an incredible Black-owned financial enterprise from the ground up, working twice as hard as anyone else to overcome systemic barriers. She spun a fabricated fairy tale about how our parents had generously decided to invest their hard-earned money into his visionary fund to support minority entrepreneurship. Then came the fatal lie. Brittany wiped a fake tear from her cheek and told her followers that I had maliciously frozen the family assets out of pure spite. She claimed I used a legal loophole to sabotage the transfer because I could not stand the thought of a Black man succeeding where I had failed. She painted a horrifyingly false picture describing me as a ruthless corporate operative who actively used my accounting skills to oppress minorities and destroy minority-owned businesses. She pleaded with her audience, asking them how any sister could be so cruel and racially motivated as to steal funding right out of the hands of a hardworking entrepreneur like Terrence. She ended the broadcast by burying her face in her hands, sobbing loudly, while Terrence pulled her into a protective embrace, looking bravely at the camera before the feed cut to black. It was a masterclass in modern digital warfare. Brittany knew exactly which progressive buzzwords to use and exactly which social trigger points to hit to mobilize an angry mob. She successfully weaponized her husband's race to shield a massive real estate fraud, and the internet consumed every single word of it without asking for a shred of actual proof. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. My firm's public inbox began filling with hundreds of angry emails demanding my immediate termination. Activist accounts were sharing screenshots of my professional headshot, branding me a corporate racist. My personal pages were flooded with hate comments, death threats, and messages telling me I was a disgusting human being. They coordinated a mass campaign to tank my business, leaving thousands of one-star reviews on every platform they could find. They accused me of financial discrimination, client sabotage, and bigotry. The digital mob was trying to digitally execute me, attempting to destroy my livelihood and starve me into submission. They thought that public shame would force me to surrender the $15 million blind trust just to make the harassment stop. Dominic stood behind my desk watching the vicious comments roll across my computer monitor. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes narrowing as he read a particularly graphic death threat from one of Brittany's loyal followers. He reached for his phone, ready to draft an immediate cease and desist order and file a defamation lawsuit that would scorch the earth. I placed my hand gently over his, stopping him. I looked up at my brilliant, ruthless fiancé and smiled a genuinely warm smile. I told him not to interrupt an enemy while they are busy making a fatal mistake. Defamation lawsuits take months to process. I do not have months, and I certainly do not care about the opinions of anonymous internet strangers. Engaging with a digital mob is a completely losing battle because they operate entirely on misplaced outrage rather than verifiable facts. If I released a statement defending myself, I would only be giving oxygen to her ridiculous lies. I would look defensive and weak. I operate exclusively on data, and data does not require a public relations campaign to be devastatingly effective. Brittany thought her massive online audience was a weapon that would break my spirit. She did not realize she had just placed a massive, blinding spotlight directly onto Terrence and his supposed financial empire. By broadcasting his name and his business to hundreds of thousands of people, she had practically begged the world to look closely at Apex Visionary Capital. She wanted everyone to see her husband as a successful, brilliant martyr. I was going to use that exact same spotlight to show the entire world that he was nothing more than a pathetic common thief. I closed the social media applications, completely ignoring the thousands of incoming hate messages. I did not post a rebuttal. I did not turn my accounts to private. I left the doors wide open, letting them scream into the void. I opened my encrypted forensic software instead. The mob could have their fun on the internet for the next few hours, while they felt righteous and victorious. They could believe the carefully constructed lies of the golden child and her grifter husband. I was going back to work. I cracked my knuckles and began typing, pulling up public registry databases and tax records. I was about to dive deep into the digital breadcrumbs of Terrence's financial life, and I knew exactly what I was going to find. I did not type a single angry response. I did not post a tearful defense video. I did not engage with the furious mob Brittany had unleashed. Engaging with an internet mob is a losing battle because they operate entirely on misplaced outrage rather than verifiable facts. I operate exclusively on data, and data does not require a public relations campaign to be devastatingly effective. Brittany thought her massive online audience was a weapon that would break my spirit and force me into submission. She did not realize she had just placed a massive, blinding spotlight directly onto Terrence and his supposed elite financial empire. By broadcasting his name and his business to hundreds of thousands of people, she had practically begged the entire world to look closely at Apex Visionary Capital. She wanted everyone to see her husband as a successful, brilliant martyr. I was going to use that exact same spotlight to show the entire world that he was nothing more than a pathetic common thief. I closed the social media applications, completely ignoring the thousands of incoming hate messages. I left the digital doors wide open, letting the mob scream into the void while they felt righteous and victorious. I opened my encrypted forensic software instead. I cracked my knuckles and began typing, pulling up public registry databases and tax records. I was about to dive deep into the digital breadcrumbs of Terrence's financial life, and I knew exactly what I was going to find. The digital onslaught was immediate and vicious, but I tuned it out entirely. My focus narrowed to the glowing screen in front of me. I started with the basics, pulling Terrence's public corporate filings for Apex Visionary Capital. If Terrence was desperate enough to participate in a $15 million real estate forgery to inject cash into his fund, there was a catastrophic hole in his balance sheet. I just needed to find it. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously tracing the web of limited liability companies and shell corporations Terrence had established. I pulled state corporate registry records, cross-referenced his LLC filings, and analyzed the aggressive marketing materials he posted online. Terrence loved to flaunt his wealth, showing off luxury cars, chartered flights, and designer watches. In forensic accounting, we call this the lifestyle discrepancy. When a fund manager's personal spending drastically outpaces their verifiable corporate growth, they are usually paying themselves with principal investments rather than actual yields. I traced the registered address of Apex Visionary Capital. It was not a prestigious downtown office building. It was a virtual mail drop, a common tactic used to project corporate legitimacy without paying commercial rent. I dug into the regulatory databases. Legitimate hedge funds, handling the kind of capital Terrence bragged about, are required to file specific disclosures with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I searched the SEC database for his name and his company. The results returned 0 matches. Terrence was operating completely unregistered, soliciting millions from private investors without any federal oversight or mandatory compliance audits. The picture became terrifyingly clear as I analyzed the flow of capital between his various shell companies. Terrence was not a visionary entrepreneur running a hedge fund. He was an unlicensed amateur running a textbook Ponzi scheme. He was using funds from new investors to pay fake returns to older investors while skimming massive amounts off the top to fund Britney's lavish lifestyle. The $15 million they tried to steal from my blind trust was not meant for investment. It was a desperate bailout. Terrence's scheme was collapsing. The older investors were likely demanding their payouts, and the well of new victims had run dry. If Vanguard Corporation had actually wired that $15 million, Terrence would have immediately used it to plug the bleeding holes in his fake fund, preventing his angry investors from calling the authorities. I compiled all the data into a secure encrypted folder. I documented the lack of SEC registration, the virtual office shell companies, and the aggressive social media marketing that promised unrealistic guaranteed returns. I mapped out the exact timeline showing that Britney's new Porsche was purchased exactly 2 days after Terrence secured a fresh round of funding from a local medical group. It was pure, unadulterated fraud. My sister was crying on the internet about systemic oppression while driving a sports car funded by stolen retirement accounts. I printed the key documents, sliding them into a sleek black folder. The phone on my desk rang. It was Dominic calling from his corporate law office. I answered, putting him on speakerphone while I organized the paperwork. Dominic sounded sharp, his lawyer instincts fully activated. He informed me that Terrence and Edward had just showed up at my accounting firm's downtown building, demanding to see me. They were currently screaming at the receptionist, threatening to cause a massive scene if I did not come down and sign the trust over to them. They were trying to use physical intimidation to force my hand before the Vanguard lawsuit destroyed them completely. Dominic told me to stay exactly where I was. He had already left his office and was heading straight to my building. Dominic specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive negotiations. He dealt with arrogant billionaires and ruthless executives daily. 2 desperate con artists having a temper tantrum in a lobby were barely a warm-up for him. I smiled, thanking Dominic, and telling him I had a specific file I needed him to deliver to Terrence. I quickly securely emailed the Ponzi scheme dossier to Dominic's phone, giving him a brief rundown of the financial devastation I had just uncovered. I leaned back in my chair, listening as Dominic chuckled darkly over the phone. He promised me he would handle the delivery personally and ensure that Edward and Terrence understood exactly who they were messing with. The internet could scream all it wanted about my supposed cruelty. The digital mob could leave thousands of angry comments defending Brittany and her fraudulent husband. None of it mattered. The truth was neatly organized in a PDF file, and the moment those numbers hit the light of day, their entire fake empire would crumble into dust. I sipped my coffee feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. They had brought a PR crisis to my doorstep, but I was about to serve them a federal indictment. Down in the sprawling marble lobby of my accounting firm, the scene was rapidly deteriorating into absolute chaos. I watched the high-definition security feed perfectly streaming to my laptop monitor. Terrence was leaning aggressively over the curved mahogany reception desk, pointing his finger directly at the terrified receptionist. His voice echoed through the cavernous space, demanding that I come down immediately and face my family. My father Edward stood just a few paces behind him, his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. Edward was loudly threatening to call the police, claiming I had stolen family assets, and that this was a private emergency requiring my immediate cooperation. They were throwing a massive public tantrum, hoping that the sheer embarrassment of a scene would force me to surrender the blind trust and sign over $15 million. They did not realize they were not dealing with a scared 20-year-old girl anymore. They were dealing with a woman who had a ruthless corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer for a fiancé. Dominic strode through the revolving glass doors, his presence instantly shifting the entire gravity of the room. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of any emotion. Dominic dealt with hostile billionaires, aggressive board members, and ruthless executives on a daily basis. Two desperate amateur con artists having a meltdown in a lobby were absolutely nothing to him. Dominic did not announce himself or raise his voice. He simply walked straight up behind Terrence and smoothly inserted himself directly between the receptionist and the two men. He raised one hand, establishing an immediate physical boundary, and calmly instructed the receptionist to take her lunch break right now. The young woman nodded gratefully and quickly darted away, leaving Terrence and Edward facing a solid brick wall of legal hostility. Edward stepped forward, trying to use his booming patriarch voice to regain control of the situation. He demanded to know who Dominic was and ordered him to step aside, claiming that this was private family business. Edward insisted that no outside lawyer had any right to interfere with a father speaking to his own daughter. Dominic smiled a cold, calculating smile that he usually reserved for destroying hostile corporate bids in the boardroom. He looked Edward directly in the eyes and informed him that when family business involves $15 million in federal wire fraud, forged legal documents, and an active Vanguard Corporation investigation, it automatically becomes a matter for outside counsel. Terrence sneered, attempting to regain the narrative and project dominance. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height to physically intimidate Dominic. Terrence loudly accused Dominic of protecting a racist and claimed that my refusal to sign over the transfer deed was a direct malicious attack on his minority-owned enterprise. He threatened to call the local news stations and drag my accounting firm through the mud unless I came down and signed the transfer paperwork immediately. He leaned in close, trying to look menacing. Dominic did not even flinch. He did not blink. He slowly and methodically reached into his premium leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick printed copy of the exact dossier I had emailed him just 20 minutes prior. He tossed the heavy stack of papers onto the glass coffee table in the center of the lobby. The sharp, heavy thud echoed loudly across the marble floors, demanding attention. Dominic looked directly at Terrence and suggested he stop weaponizing his race to cover up the undeniable fact that he was operating an unregistered illegal Ponzi scheme. The color instantly drained from Terrence's face. His aggressive swagger completely evaporated. Dominic did not give him a single second to recover. He began methodically laying out the devastating facts. He stated loudly enough for the building security guards to hear that Apex Visionary Capital had absolutely zero filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Dominic tapped the top of the folder. He detailed the massive lifestyle discrepancy, pointing out the exact routing numbers and transaction timestamps. He showed that the funds used to purchase Brittany's brand new shiny Porsche were traced directly back to an investment deposit made by a local dental practice just 48 hours prior. But Dominic was not finished. He pulled out another sheet of paper showing a massive offshore wire transfer to a luxury jeweler in Dubai. He asked Terrence if his investors knew that a huge chunk of their hard-earned retirement funds was used to purchase a $100,000 diamond necklace for his wife, instead of being allocated into the high-yield bonds he promised them. Edward looked at Terrence, his eyes wide with sudden, horrific realization. Edward had been arrogant enough to forge a power of attorney to get the Vanguard money, but he genuinely believed Terrence was a financial genius who would multiply the cash and make them untouchable. Now standing in the bright lobby, Edward realized the catastrophic truth. He had risked a decade in federal prison to steal $15 million just to bail out his son-in-law's collapsing multi-million-dollar scam. There was no elite hedge fund. There was no visionary investment strategy. There was only blatant theft. Dominic leaned in close to Terrence, dropping his voice to a lethal, uncompromising whisper. He promised Terrence that if he or Edward ever stepped foot near me again, or if Brittany posted one more lying video on the internet, that entire dossier would be immediately forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. He looked at his luxury watch. Dominic informed them that they had exactly 30 seconds to vacate the premises before he instructed the armed security guards to arrest them for criminal trespassing and harassment. Terrence did not say a single word. The loud, confident financial guru was gone, replaced by the pure, visceral terror of a fraudster who knows he has been caught dead to rights. He turned and practically sprinted toward the revolving glass doors, pushing past a delivery worker in his desperate haste to escape. He fled the building entirely, leaving Edward standing completely alone. Edward looked at the dossier on the glass table, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked up at Dominic, opening his mouth to formulate an excuse or perhaps plead for mercy, but no words came out. His entire fake reality had just been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. The wealthy, respected patriarch was exposed as a gullible, desperate criminal. He turned and shuffled out of the building, a broken, pathetic man clutching his coat against the cold reality of his impending ruin. I watched the entire encounter through the security feed from the safety of my desk. The precision of the takedown was absolutely beautiful. They had come to intimidate me into giving up my inheritance, and instead they left with the terrifying knowledge that I held the absolute keys to their federal prosecution. I closed the laptop feed, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. The legal wall had been built, and it was utterly impenetrable. However, I knew my mother Cynthia well enough to understand that logic and evidence would not stop her endless delusion. She operated on the belief that social status could shield her from any consequence. If she could not bully me privately, and Terrence could not intimidate me physically, she would retreat to her ultimate comfort zone, which meant manipulating the wealthy elite. The next phase of their self-destruction was about to begin. For most rational human beings, the immediate threat of federal indictment and the freezing of a $15 million fraudulent transaction would prompt a severe reevaluation of life choices. A normal person would hire a criminal defense attorney and immediately begin liquidating assets to prepare for the crushing legal fees. But my mother Cynthia was not a normal person. She was a deeply entrenched narcissist whose entire psychological foundation was built exclusively on the perception of extreme wealth. To her, losing her money was a temporary inconvenience, but losing her social status was an absolute death sentence. Despite standing on the terrifying precipice of total financial ruin, Cynthia absolutely refused to cancel her annual high society autumn charity gala. She had spent the last 8 months planning this specific event to secure her position at the very top of the local elite hierarchy. The gala was scheduled to take place at the most exclusive luxury hotel in the city, a venue that required a massive, non-refundable deposit. Knowing what I knew about their current financial hemorrhaging, I realized they were likely funding this extravagant party using the last remaining scraps of available credit they possessed. They were maxing out high-interest credit cards, just to buy imported champagne and exotic floral arrangements for people who secretly despise them. Cynthia believed with every fiber of her delusional being that if she simply threw the most spectacular party of the season, the whispering rumors about her financial collapse would magically vanish. She thought that wealth was a performance, and if she just acted the part, the reality of her impending bankruptcy would somehow fail to materialize. But Cynthia did not just want to throw a party to maintain her fragile illusion. She wanted blood. Since she could not legally force me to sign over the blind trust, and Terence could not physically intimidate me into submission, she decided to attack the one thing she knew I valued above everything else: my professional reputation. The evening of the charity gala arrived draped in forced elegance and desperate grandeur. The hotel ballroom was transformed into an autumn wonderland, with thousands of imported silk leaves and crystal centerpieces towering over the tables. The city elite arrived in their tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, completely unaware that their gracious host was actively dodging calls from corporate fraud investigators. Cynthia wore a stunning emerald green gown, dripping in diamonds, that I strongly suspected were heavily insured rentals. She floated through the crowded ballroom carrying a glass of vintage champagne, greeting local politicians and wealthy business magnates with a perfectly rehearsed, dazzling smile. However, Cynthia was not just mingling to stroke her own ego. She was on a highly calculated hunting expedition. She knew exactly which corporate executives in that room were my high-net-worth clients. I had built my forensic accounting firm from the ground up, securing contracts with massive corporations, hospital networks, and private wealth groups. These were men and women who valued absolute discretion, ironclad integrity, and razor-sharp mental acuity. Cynthia understood that my firm relied entirely on trust. If my clients believed for a single second that I was unstable, my multi-million-dollar contracts would evaporate overnight. Cynthia began systematically cornering my most lucrative clients near the champagne fountains and the raw oyster bars. She played the role of the tragically heartbroken mother with absolute terrifying perfection. She would gently touch the arm of a powerful chief executive officer, lowering her voice to a concerned theatrical whisper. She wove a masterful, intricate web of vicious lies specifically designed to trigger their corporate risk management instincts. She told them that the family was currently going through a devastating private crisis because her eldest daughter Caroline was suffering from a severe, unmanageable mental breakdown. Cynthia dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes, claiming that the pressure of my career had finally shattered my fragile psyche. She whispered that I was currently experiencing severe paranoid delusions and hallucinations, making completely erratic financial decisions, and launching baseless, malicious attacks against my own family members. She painted a horrifyingly false picture of a woman completely detached from reality. Cynthia then expertly drove the knife deeper. She leaned in close to these powerful executives, warning them out of the goodness of her maternal heart that trusting their sensitive corporate accounts to my firm was a massive, unmitigated liability. She claimed I was currently under confidential investigation for professional malpractice and erratic accounting behavior. She suggested that if they did not immediately pull their accounts from my firm, they risked exposing their own companies to my supposed psychotic financial mismanagement. She was actively trying to destroy my entire livelihood, attempting to starve me into total submission. She firmly believed that if she ruined my professional reputation and successfully tanked my accounting firm, I would come crawling back to the family estate. She thought I would be so desperate for money and so completely broken by the sudden loss of my career that I would willingly sign over the multi-million-dollar blind trust just to survive. She smiled sweetly at my client sipping her expensive champagne, completely unaware of a fatal flaw in her malicious strategy. When you are a top-tier forensic accountant who saves companies from brutal audits and internal embezzlement, you do not just build a client list. You build an army of fiercely loyal allies. Cynthia targeted a specific chief executive officer whose manufacturing company I had recently saved from a vicious $5 million tax penalty. She fed him her entire sob story about my supposed mental collapse. The executive nodded politely, offering Cynthia his deepest fake sympathies. The very second Cynthia turned her back to target her next victim, that executive immediately pulled out his encrypted smartphone. He texted me a complete verbatim transcript of every single malicious lie my mother was actively spreading across the ballroom. My mother wanted to play dirty high society games, but she severely underestimated the loyalty of my network. It was time to show her exactly how a forensic accountant crashes a party. I did not waste a single second raging over my mother's desperate attempts at character assassination. I opened my closet and bypassed my standard corporate suits. Tonight required armor of a different caliber. I pulled out a floor-length midnight blue silk gown. It was sharp, sophisticated, and tailored to perfection. I paired it with diamond studs and swept my hair back into a flawless twist. I did not want to look like a victim. I needed to look like exactly what I was, which is the most dangerous financial predator in the room. I gathered 5 identical sleek leather folders from my desk. Inside each folder was the condensed proof of Terrence's unregistered Ponzi scheme, complete with bank routing numbers and highlighted lifestyle discrepancies. I slid the dossiers into an elegant clutch and ordered a private car to the luxury hotel. When I arrived, the valet staff rushed to open my door. I bypassed the main registration table entirely. I knew this hotel layout perfectly, having audited their parent company 2 years prior. I slipped through the side gallery entrance, moving with quiet purpose. The ballroom was a symphony of clinking crystal and pretentious laughter. I stood in the shadowed archway, taking a moment to survey the hunting ground. I spotted my mother Cynthia weeping dramatic fake tears to the chief financial officer of a logistics firm. Across the room, near the VIP seating area, I located my primary targets. Terrence was holding court with 3 prominent local venture capitalists. These were extremely wealthy men who managed massive private portfolios. Terrence was grinning, leaning close, and gesturing wildly with his hands. He was pressing them to write massive checks to his fake hedge fund tonight. He needed their capital to bail out his collapsing scheme before federal authorities knocked. I stepped out of the shadows and glided across the ballroom floor. My gown caught the light, but I moved with deliberate silence. I did not storm into the center of the room. I did not raise my voice or throw a drink. True power does not require a temper tantrum. I approached the VIP seating area from the rear, out of Terrence's line of sight. I caught the eye of the first venture capitalist, a silver-haired man named Richard, who I had previously advised on a corporate merger. Richard smiled, preparing to greet me loudly. I placed a manicured finger over my lips, signaling for silence. He frowned in confusion but complied. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the first folder. I pressed it firmly into his hand. I leaned down and whispered directly into his ear. I told him he had exactly 5 minutes to review page 3 before he made the worst financial mistake of his entire career. I moved seamlessly to the next target. It was a retired tech magnate named William. I slid the second folder onto the cocktail table next to his glass of scotch. I did not say a single word to him. I tapped the silver lettering on the cover that read "Red Flags" and gave him a knowing look. I knew these men. They were ruthless predators possessing an aggressive instinct for self-preservation. I distributed the remaining 3 folders to the other wealthy investors hovering in Terrence's immediate orbit, executing the drops with the precision of a ghost. Terrence was so consumed by his own arrogant monologue about disruptive market yields that he never even noticed me standing less than 5 feet away, dismantling his entire future. I retreated to a quiet corner near the grand piano, folding my hands together and watching the psychological dominoes begin to fall. Richard was the first to open his folder. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted bank transfer showing Terrence's investor capital paying for Brittany's luxury sports car. The warm, affluent color instantly drained from Richard's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He abruptly closed the folder, clutching it tightly against his chest. He stood up, interrupting Terrence's loud pitch mid-sentence. Richard muttered a clipped, tense apology about a sudden family emergency. He did not shake Terrence's hand. He simply turned and walked briskly toward the exit. William opened his folder next. He flipped directly to the page documenting the complete lack of Securities and Exchange Commission filings. William let out a sharp intake of breath. He looked up at Terence not with admiration, but with sheer, unadulterated disgust. William stood up, leaving his expensive scotch completely untouched. He signaled to the other two investors who were rapidly reading their own dossiers. A silent, panicked consensus rippled through the group of wealthy men. One by one, they stood up, avoiding eye contact with Terence entirely. They muttered vague excuses about feeling unwell and needing to leave the gala immediately. They clutched the black folders like life preservers and joined the rapid exodus toward the ballroom doors. Terence stood completely alone in the VIP section, his arms frozen mid-gesture. His charismatic smile morphed into a mask of pure, total confusion. He looked around wildly, trying to understand why millions of dollars in potential capital had just evaporated into thin air in less than 60 seconds. He had no idea what was inside those black folders, but he knew his survival had just walked out the door. The panic in his eyes was absolute. His Ponzi scheme was officially dead. Across the ballroom, Cynthia noticed the sudden mass departure of her most important guests. She excused herself from the logistics executive and marched toward the VIP section to investigate. As she crossed the floor, her eyes swept the perimeter and locked directly onto mine. I stood still by the piano, holding my empty clutch. I offered my mother a slow, terrifyingly calm smile and raised my glass of sparkling water in a mock toast. Cynthia stopped dead in her tracks, the realization crashing over her. The silent takedown was now complete, and she was left entirely bankrupt. The sudden mass exodus of the wealthy venture capitalists left a glaring hole in the carefully curated high society atmosphere. Cynthia stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, her emerald green gown suddenly looking more like a costume than a symbol of power. She realized the elite guests were whispering, checking their phones, and casting sideways glances toward the VIP section where Terence stood alone. The charity gala had officially mutated into a public relations disaster. I did not stick around to watch my mother attempt to salvage the burning wreckage of her social standing. The tactical strike was complete, and the objective was achieved. I turned on my heels and walked smoothly out of the ballroom, leaving my mother staring at my back. I glided through the opulent hotel lobby, ignoring the bewildered looks of the late-arriving guests. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, walking directly toward the brightly lit valet queue. Dominic was already waiting for me, leaning casually against the polished hood of his black sedan. He was scrolling through his phone, a faint smile playing on his lips. I approached him, linking my arm through his and exhaling a long, satisfied breath. Dominic looked up from his screen. He informed me that the news of Terence's fraudulent hedge fund had already hit the private financial forums. The documents I handed out had acted like digital wildfire, spreading rapidly among the city's elite investors. As we stood there waiting for the valet attendant to bring the car around, the heavy glass doors of the hotel burst open. Terence and Brittany practically sprinted out of the lobby. Brittany was hysterical, her makeup smeared down her cheeks as she frantically searched her designer handbag for her valet ticket. Terence was red-faced and sweating aggressively, barking orders into his cell phone, trying desperately to reach his overseas banking contacts. They had realized the absolute catastrophic reality of their situation and were attempting a rapid, panicked retreat. Brittany spotted me standing calmly next to Dominic. Her eyes widened with pure, unfiltered rage. She stomped toward us, her expensive heels clicking angrily against the pavement. She pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You did this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You ruined everything. You are a jealous, bitter monster, Caroline. You could not stand seeing me happy, so you sabotaged Terence's business." I simply looked at her, completely unmoved by her theatrical meltdown. I told her I did not sabotage anything. I just handed her investors the actual bank statements. I suggested she ask her brilliant husband why his supposedly multi-million-dollar hedge fund had zero registered capital and no legal filings. I told her to ask Terence why he had to forge a real estate deed just to keep the lights on. Before Brittany could unleash another hysterical scream, a loud, grating mechanical noise echoed through the valet queue. The sound of heavy diesel engines and grinding gears completely drowned out her voice. Everyone in the valet line turned to look, including Terence, who had finally stopped yelling into his phone. A massive rusted tow truck slowly reversed into the brightly lit driveway. The warning lights on the top of the cab flashed blindingly yellow. The driver, a burly man in a reflective safety vest, hopped out of the cab holding a thick clipboard. He walked directly toward the valet stand, completely ignoring the crowd of wealthy gala guests in their tuxedos and ball gowns. The tow truck driver handed the clipboard to the stunned valet manager. He loudly announced that he had a court-ordered repossession order for a white Porsche 911 registered under Terrence's holding company. Brittany's face drained of all color. She whipped her head around, looking frantically at Terrence. "Terrence, what is he talking about?" She gasped, the hysteria returning full force. "That is my car. You bought that car for me. Tell him to leave." Terrence did not say a word. He stood frozen, his phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the concrete driveway. He looked absolutely terrified. The tow truck driver did not wait for an explanation. He efficiently maneuvered his truck, backing it up, precisely aligning the heavy metal hooks with the front axle of the gleaming white Porsche that Terrence had so proudly tossed the keys to at Thanksgiving dinner just a few days prior. The hydraulic lift engaged, groaning loudly as it hoisted the front wheels of the luxury sports car off the pavement. Brittany lost her mind entirely. She sprinted toward the tow truck, waving her arms wildly and screaming at the driver to stop. She claimed there was a massive misunderstanding, that her husband was a wealthy venture capitalist and that the bank had made a terrible mistake. The driver ignored her, expertly securing the chains and locking the tires into place. Brittany whirled around, fixing her furious gaze directly on me. "You called them!" she shrieked, charging toward me. "You malicious, vindictive witch! You called the bank and told them to steal my car!" Dominic smoothly stepped in front of me, intercepting Brittany before she could get any closer. He held up a hand, projecting an aura of absolute legal menace. He warned her to take a step back and lower her voice immediately. I stepped out from behind Dominic, meeting Brittany's hysterical gaze with terrifying calm. "I don't work for the bank, Brittany," I said, my voice cold and precise, cutting through her frantic screaming. "And I certainly didn't call them. They called themselves. I suggest you ask your broke husband which offshore account your car payments went to for the last 6 months, because it clearly was not the dealership." Brittany slowly turned to look at Terrence, the realization finally crashing over her that her entire luxurious reality was built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Terrence could not even meet her eyes. He stared at the pavement, looking like a pathetic, cornered animal. The tow truck driver climbed back into his cab, honking his loud horn twice as a warning before pulling away. We all stood there watching as the gleaming white Porsche was unceremoniously towed out of the luxury hotel driveway, disappearing into the cold autumn night. The physical manifestation of their fraudulent empire was literally dragged away right in front of the city's elite. Cynthia finally emerged from the hotel, rushing out just in time to see the taillights of the tow truck fade away. She looked wildly at Brittany, who had collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked at Terrence, who was desperately trying to pick up the pieces of his shattered phone. And finally, she looked at me, standing calmly next to Dominic, our car pulling up to the valet stand. I offered my mother a small, knowing smile. The silent takedown was complete. The repossession was just the cherry on top. I opened the car door, settling into the plush leather seat. I rolled down the window, looking at the broken, fraudulent family I was leaving behind. I told them to enjoy the rest of the gala and suggested they might want to call a cab to get home. I rolled the window up, leaving them standing in the cold, glaring light of the valet queue, their illusions of wealth and status completely and utterly destroyed. The morning after the gala disaster, I woke up feeling remarkably refreshed. The frantic voicemails from my mother had finally stopped arriving around 3 in the morning, likely because her phone battery died, or she simply passed out from the sheer exhaustion of her own public humiliation. I dressed in a sharp, tailored gray suit, grabbed my briefcase, and headed to my favorite upscale coffee shop located just 2 blocks from my accounting firm. I needed a strong double espresso before finalizing the legal paperwork Dominic had drafted the night before. The coffee shop was quiet, filled with corporate executives and lawyers speaking in hushed tones. I ordered my drink and took a seat at a secluded corner booth facing the door. I always sit facing the entrance. In forensic accounting, you learn very quickly to never let anyone sneak up behind you. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the cafe swung open. I watched as a man shuffled inside, looking frantically around the room. It took me a full 5 seconds to recognize my own father. Edward looked absolutely terrible. The towering, arrogant patriarch who had confidently demanded $15 million at Thanksgiving dinner was completely gone. In his place was a disheveled, sweating, terrified old man. He wore a wrinkled trench coat over a hastily buttoned shirt that lacked a tie. His silver hair, which was usually styled to perfection, stuck up in odd directions. He looked like a man who was actively being hunted. He spotted me in the corner booth and practically ran across the cafe. He did not ask for permission to join me. He simply collapsed into the leather chair across the table, breathing heavily. He looked over his shoulder twice, as if expecting federal agents to walk through the door at any second. "Caroline," he gasped out, his hands shaking violently as he reached across the table. "Thank God you are here. I have been waiting outside your building all morning. I knew you always get coffee here. You have to help me. Please, Caroline, you are the only one who understands the numbers." I did not pull my hands away, but I did not offer them to him either. I kept my posture relaxed, leaning back against the leather booth. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and quietly tapped the screen. I activated the secure voice recording application, placing the phone face down on the polished wooden table right between our coffee cups. I looked at him with polite clinical detachment. "You look terrible, Edward," I stated, taking a slow sip of my espresso. "I imagine the reality of federal wire fraud is disrupting your sleep schedule. What do you want?" Edward flinched at the word fraud. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a desperate, raspy whisper. "It is over, Caroline. It is completely over. Vanguard Corporation filed an official notice of fraudulent conveyance this morning. Their legal team is not negotiating. They forwarded the entire file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents have already frozen all of my personal bank accounts. Cynthia tried to buy a plane ticket to Paris an hour ago, and her credit cards declined. Every single one of them." I nodded, slowly processing the data. Vanguard moved faster than I anticipated. "Good for them," I said. "That still does not explain why you are sitting across from me begging. You made your bed. Now you get to sleep in a federal penitentiary." Edward let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. Actual tears began to well up in his eyes, spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. He covered his face with his trembling hands, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "I cannot go to prison, Caroline," he cried. "I am 60 years old. I will not survive in there. Terrence ruined everything. That arrogant fool promised me his fund was legitimate. He swore to me that if I just got him the Vanguard capital, he could patch the holes and make us all billionaires. He lied to me." I tilted my head, studying him. "So you are the victim here?" I asked, letting the sarcasm drip heavily from my words. "You forged my signature and attempted to steal $15 million from your own daughter, but it is Terrence's fault because he was a worse criminal than you." Edward ignored the insult. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, sliding it across the table. It was a printout of flight itineraries and a list of banking regulations for a small island nation in the Caribbean, a nation notorious for refusing extradition requests from the United States government. "I need $2 million, Caroline," he whispered, his eyes wide and frantic. "Just $2 million. It is a drop in the bucket compared to what is in your blind trust. You can wire it to this offshore routing number. It is completely untraceable. If you send it right now, I can be on a private charter flight to Belize by noon. The authorities do not have my passport flagged yet. I can disappear. I can start over." I looked at the crumpled paper and then back at my father. I wanted to make sure the audio recording captured every single nuance of his cowardly plan. "Let me get this straight," I said, ensuring my voice was loud and clear. "You want me to wire $2 million of my own inheritance to an offshore account so you can flee the country and evade federal prosecution for fraud?" "Yes." Edward nodded vigorously, completely oblivious to the legal trap he was stepping into. "Please, Caroline, You are the only one who has liquid capital. I will pay you back, I swear it. Once I am settled, I will find a way to make it right. I tapped the edge of my coffee cup. And what about your wife? I asked. What about Cynthia? What about Brittany and Terrence? Are they joining you on this flight to Belize? Edward let out a bitter, selfish scoff. A look of pure survival instinct crossed his face, stripping away decades of fake family loyalty. Are you kidding me? He hissed. Cynthia is a liability. She cannot survive without luxury, and she will just slow me down. Brittany is completely brainwashed by that idiot Terrence. They deserve exactly what is coming to them. Terrence built that Ponzi scheme. Let him take the fall for it. Let Cynthia deal with the bankruptcy. I am not going down with a sinking ship. I have to save myself. I sat there staring at the man who had raised me. It was genuinely breathtaking to witness the absolute depths of his cowardice. He had spent his entire life bragging about being the patriarch of the family, demanding respect and obedience. But the second he faced actual consequences, he was entirely willing to throw his wife and his golden child directly under the bus to save his own skin. He was a rat fleeing a burning building. I reached forward and picked up my smartphone. I flipped it over, revealing the active recording application. The bright red timer was ticking steadily, showing exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds of crystal clear, high-definition audio. I tapped the screen, saving the file, and uploading it directly to my firm's secure encrypted cloud server. Edward stared at the phone. His eyes darted from the screen to my face. The realization of what I had just done hit him with the force of a freight train. He stopped breathing, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. Did you just record me? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the coffee shop. I smiled, sliding the phone back into my blazer pocket. I am a forensic accountant. Edward, I replied, my voice dripping with absolute zero mercy. I document everything. I document the fraud, and I certainly document the confession. You just admitted to wire fraud conspiracy to flee federal prosecution and intent to abandon your co-conspirators. That is not just a smoking gun. That is a wrapped and bowed gift for the prosecutors. Edward lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the table. You cannot do this to me, Caroline. He begged, his voice cracking. I am your father. I gave you life. And I am giving you a reality check, I countered, standing up from the booth and smoothing my suit jacket. You do not get $2 million. You do not get a flight to Belize. You get exactly what you earned. I am forwarding this audio file to the Vanguard legal team and the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I suggest you stop drinking coffee and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney. I picked up my briefcase and turned my back on him. I walked out of the coffee shop into the bright morning sunlight, leaving Edward sobbing quietly into his hands, surrounded by the ruins of his own pathetic cowardice. His confession was secured. The family was fracturing from the inside out, and the final showdown was rapidly approaching. Less than 24 hours after I left Edward weeping into his coffee, a fleet of black corporate vehicles pulled up to the Beacon Hill mansion. Vanguard Corporation did not send standard civilian process servers to handle a $15 million fraud. They sent their elite corporate fixers flanked by off-duty federal marshals. The heavy legal envelope they delivered was not an invitation to negotiate. It was an absolute, uncompromising ultimatum drafted by some of the most ruthless litigators in the country. The document demanded that Edward, Cynthia, Brittany, and Terrence present themselves at Vanguard Global Headquarters by 2 p.m. the very next day. The terms laid out in the paperwork were brutally clear. They either showed up to formally resolve the fraudulent real estate contract, or Vanguard Legal would immediately hand their completed criminal referral directly to the federal prosecutors waiting in the lobby. One would reasonably expect a family facing imminent federal imprisonment to behave with a shred of humility, or at least basic human terror. But humility requires a fundamental connection to reality, and my mother had severed her connection to the real world decades ago. According to the frantic, unhinged voicemails Brittany left on my phone, which I listened to purely for the tactical intelligence, Cynthia spent the entire evening treating the federal summons like a high society gala invitation. She operated under the massive delusion that Vanguard was just a group of wealthy old men who could be easily swayed by a few manufactured tears and a sob story about a tragic family misunderstanding. She actually booked an emergency morning appointment with her hairstylist and laid out a tailored designer suit to ensure she looked appropriately fragile, yet fiercely elegant for the meeting. Terrence was equally submerged in his own aggressive delusions of grandeur. He spent the entire morning loudly pacing the marble floors of the mansion, practicing a highly weaponized speech. He genuinely believed he could walk into a multi-billion-dollar corporate stronghold and manipulate their executive board by playing his favorite victim card. He planned to aggressively accuse Vanguard of employing predatory corporate tactics against a rising minority-owned business. He was fully prepared to spin his blatant attempt to steal $15 million as a minor administrative oversight that was being blown completely out of proportion by systemic bias. He confidently told Brittany that they were not going to apologize to the executives. He claimed they were going to demand a formal apology from Vanguard for freezing the escrow account and disrupting his visionary financial hedge fund. Brittany eagerly absorbed every single word of her husband's delusional confidence. She spent hours curating the perfect outfit to play the role of the innocent, dutiful wife caught in a corporate misunderstanding. She chose a conservative pastel dress and practiced her wide-eyed, sympathetic look in the mirror. She fully intended to sit next to Terrence and cry softly on command, believing her performance would make the corporate lawyers feel guilty for threatening her luxurious lifestyle. She was absolutely certain that by the end of the meeting, the executives would unfreeze the $15 million and apologize for the inconvenience. Edward was the only person in that house who truly understood the catastrophic, unmitigated danger they were in. After our encounter at the coffee shop, he had returned home a hollowed-out, broken shell of a man. He knew I held the audio recording of his cowardly confession and his explicit intent to abandon his wife and children. He knew the federal authorities were likely already tracking his passport and monitoring his bank accounts. He walked through the mansion like a condemned prisoner marching toward the gallows. He looked at Cynthia fussing over her diamond earrings and Terrence rehearsing his fake outrage, and he knew they were walking straight into a slaughterhouse. But Edward was too weak to stand up to Cynthia's overwhelming delusion and too terrified to run now that I had his confession secured. He simply put on his expensive tailored suit, swallowed his rising panic, and followed his family into the waiting luxury sedan. The Vanguard Corporation headquarters was an architectural masterpiece specifically designed to project absolute financial dominance and psychological intimidation. It was a towering monolith of black glass and brushed steel, piercing the downtown skyline like a weapon. When my family arrived, they were not greeted by friendly receptionists or offered sparkling water. They were met in the vast, echoing lobby by stern security personnel who immediately confiscated their cell phones and subjected them to a rigorous screening process. The atmosphere was deliberately engineered by the corporation to strip away any sense of comfort, entitlement, or power before the meeting even began. They were escorted through a labyrinth of silent, sterile corridors, passing rows of glass-enclosed offices where analysts and lawyers worked with ruthless efficiency. Yet despite the overwhelming corporate intimidation tactics, Cynthia and Terrence walked through those halls with their chins held high, radiating an unearned, supreme arrogance. Cynthia adjusted her designer jacket, flashing a condescending, practiced smile at the security guards leading the way. She whispered sharp instructions to Brittany, reminding her exactly when to let her voice tremble during the meeting. Terrence strutted forward, his chest puffed out, pulling at his cuffs and preparing to unleash his self-righteous monologue on whoever was sitting behind the boardroom doors. They approached the heavy frosted glass double doors of the main executive suite. The security guard swiped his keycard, and the doors unlatched with a heavy mechanical click. Cynthia took a deep breath, arranging her features into a mask of polite high society distress. Terrence stood tall, projecting the false swagger of a brilliant financial mind who was about to put a room full of corporate lawyers in their place. They were completely and utterly confident. They fully believed they were walking into that room to manipulate the executives, spin the narrative, and walk out with their $15 million prize intact. They swaggered through the heavy glass doors, totally unprepared for the absolute nightmare waiting for them on the other side. The heavy frosted glass doors glided open, revealing a boardroom that looked less like a corporate meeting space and more like a high-tech war room. A massive, polished obsidian table dominated the center, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were lined with digital monitors displaying complex financial flowcharts and legal statutes. Cynthia stepped in first, leading with her practiced high society smile, ready to play the victimized matriarch. Terrence followed closely behind her, his chest puffed out, already opening his mouth to launch into his rehearsed speech about corporate oppression. Brittany trailed them, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Edward shuffled in last, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor, completely broken by the impending reality of his actions. They stopped dead in their tracks. The confident words died in Terrence's throat, coming out as a choked, pathetic gasp. Cynthia's brilliant smile snapped off her face so violently it looked physically painful. Brittany dropped her silk handkerchief onto the pristine carpet, her jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. Sitting at the absolute head of the obsidian table, flanked on both sides by Vanguard Corporation's most senior executive board members and elite legal counsel, was me. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored black suit. My hands were folded neatly over a thick, glowing tablet that contained every single financial sin they had ever committed. I did not look like the quiet, disappointing daughter they had mocked at Thanksgiving dinner. I looked like the executioner. The Vanguard executives sitting beside me did not look at my family with sympathy or confusion. They looked at them with the cold, predatory gaze of billionaires who had just caught rats attempting to tunnel into their vault. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Terrence blinked rapidly, looking from the executives to me and back again, his brain completely failing to process the visual information. He looked like a man trying to understand how the lamb he intended to slaughter was suddenly sitting on the butcher's throne. Cynthia gripped the back of an empty chair to keep her knees from buckling. She finally managed to force a single word out of her paralyzed throat, whispering my name, as if it were a dark curse. Edward did not even look up. He had known since our encounter at the coffee shop that I held the keys to his destruction, but seeing me sitting at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar corporate tribunal finally shattered his last remaining illusion of escape. He collapsed into the nearest chair, covering his face with his trembling hands, fully preparing to face his federal indictment. I did not smile. I pressed a button on the remote in my hand, and the massive screens behind me flared to life, displaying the Vanguard corporate logo side by side with the insignia of my forensic accounting firm. I welcomed them to Vanguard Global Headquarters. My voice was amplified by the subtle acoustics of the room, carrying absolute, uncompromising authority. I introduced myself not as their daughter or sister, but by my full professional title. I informed them that Vanguard Corporation maintained a zero-tolerance policy for real estate fraud. I continued speaking, watching the devastating realization wash over their pale faces. I explained that when their automated systems flagged the expired power of attorney and the forged signature on the transfer deed, their executive board did not just call their internal legal department. They immediately contracted the most aggressive independent forensic auditing firm in the city to investigate the scope of the attempted embezzlement. Vanguard had specifically requested the lead partner of the firm to handle the investigation. They wanted someone who could trace every single stolen cent across state lines and international borders. They hired me. I told them I was not sitting in this boardroom as a family member trying to settle a domestic dispute. I was sitting here as a highly paid, legally contracted corporate mercenary, fully authorized by Vanguard to dismantle their financial lives down to the studs. Brittany let out a high-pitched, panicked whine, looking frantically at her mother for a rescue that was never going to come. Her luxury lifestyle was officially terminating right in front of her eyes. Cynthia opened her mouth, trying desperately to fall back on her classic manipulation tactics. She took a trembling step forward, attempting to force a fragile maternal tone. She called me sweetheart, begging me to stop this ridiculous prank, claiming that we could just go home and talk about this over tea. The lead Vanguard counsel, a terrifyingly sharp woman sitting to my right, slammed her hand flat against the table. She instructed Cynthia to take a seat immediately and keep her mouth shut unless spoken to. The lawyer coldly informed my mother that this was a formal corporate fraud tribunal, and any further attempts to manipulate the lead auditor would be added to the federal criminal referral currently sitting on the table. Cynthia recoiled as if she had been physically struck, finally realizing that her Beacon Hill social status meant absolutely nothing in this room. Her illusion of untouchable wealth was entirely powerless against a team of ruthless corporate litigators. Terrence realized that the emotional manipulation angle was completely dead. He decided to pivot to aggressive indignation, falling back on his practiced victim narrative. He slammed his hands onto the leather chair in front of him, trying to project strength. He loudly declared that this was a massive conflict of interest. He demanded that the Vanguard executives remove me from the room, immediately claiming I was a bitter, jealous relative trying to sabotage a legitimate minority-owned business venture. He shouted that he would sue the entire corporation for discrimination and unethical business practices. The Vanguard executives did not even flinch at his empty threats. They simply turned their heads and looked directly at me, completely turning over the floor. I stood up slowly, picking up my tablet. I looked Terrence dead in the eyes, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his fake billionaire persona. I informed him that the only conflict of interest in this room was his conflicting desire to stay out of federal prison while simultaneously running a massive unregistered Ponzi scheme. I told him to sit down, shut his mouth, and look at the screen because his fake empire was about to be burned to the ground. Terrence refused to sit down. His inflated pride would simply not allow him to surrender the floor to a woman he dismissed as a corporate drone. He puffed his chest out, planting his shoes firmly into the plush carpet of the boardroom. Pointing an aggressive, trembling finger toward the executive board, he launched into a very loud, impassioned speech. Terrence wildly accused Vanguard Corporation of employing predatory institutional tactics to crush a rising Black-owned financial enterprise. He shouted they were terrified of an independent minority entrepreneur disrupting their markets, so they hired his bitter sister-in-law to fabricate a racist smear campaign. He threatened to go to the national media and publicly expose Vanguard for systemic discrimination unless they released the $15 million immediately, and fired me. The Vanguard executives did not blink. They simply watched his frantic performance with the detached, analytical stare of apex predators analyzing a wounded animal. I did not raise my voice to interrupt his hysterical monologue. I did not need to defend my character against his baseless accusations. I simply pressed a single button on my glowing tablet. The screens covering the wall behind me instantly shifted. The corporate logos vanished, replaced by a financial flowchart. The chart mapped out the exact anatomical structure of Apex Visionary Capital. Every shell company, every hidden routing number, and every fraudulent transfer was beautifully color-coded for maximum devastating impact. The volume of the forensic data glowing on the wall instantly silenced Terrence's screaming rant. He turned his head to look at the screen, and his mouth snapped shut. I began to walk the Vanguard executives through the digital autopsy of his entire life, keeping my tone clinical and absolutely devoid of mercy. I explained how Terrence solicited millions of dollars from retirement accounts, promising them guaranteed high-yield returns. I pointed to a bright red line on the flowchart, demonstrating how the money from new investors was immediately drained to pay off the older, furious investors, demanding their promised dividends. I stated clearly for the record that Apex Visionary Capital possessed zero regulatory filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Terrence was completely unlicensed, operating a massive illegal Ponzi scheme out of a virtual mail drop located in a strip mall. Brittany sat rigidly in her leather chair, her eyes darting frantically across the screen. I tapped my tablet, bringing up a magnified section titled Lifestyle Discrepancy. I highlighted a specific deposit from a local dental group, I traced that exact deposit as it moved directly into an account used to purchase Brittany's gleaming new Porsche. I highlighted another investor deposit paying for a $100,000 diamond necklace. Terrence had not invested a single dime into the market. He was actively stealing from hard-working professionals to finance a fabricated billionaire lifestyle. Cynthia let out a gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she stared at the proof of their ruin. Edward squeezed his eyes shut, unable to even look at the screens displaying his destruction. But I was not finished. The executives at Vanguard did not hire me to just audit a con artist. They hired me to find their missing money and exact corporate retribution. I swiped my tablet to the final slide. The screen flashed, bringing up a transaction log featuring the official Vanguard Corporation watermark. I turned my attention directly back to Terrence, who was sweating profusely, his dress shirt clinging to his chest. I explained to the room that Vanguard had transferred an initial $3 million good faith deposit into the escrow account that Edward supposedly controlled to initiate the warehouse property acquisition. I projected the exact routing path of that $3 million. I showed the executives exactly how Edward unlawfully authorized the release of those funds from the escrow account using the forged power of attorney. I then tracked that massive sum of corporate capital as it bounced through two of Terrence's domestic shell companies. Finally, a bright green line on the screen drew a direct path from those shell companies straight into a private offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands account was registered exclusively and entirely under the name of Terrence. The collective sharp intake of breath from the Vanguard legal team echoed loudly in the silent room. Embezzling $3 million directly from a multi-billion-dollar financial institution was an act of profound stupidity. Terrence stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man watching his entire future evaporate into a federal prison sentence. Terrence swallowed hard, his throat visibly bobbing as he tried to formulate a defense. He stammered out a pathetic, broken excuse claiming the offshore account was a legitimate international investment diversification strategy. He tried one last desperate time to claim he was being unfairly targeted because of his background, attempting to pull the shield of systemic victimhood back over his glaring crimes. I cut him off, slicing through his final lie with surgical precision. "Do not weaponize your race to cover up textbook embezzlement, Terrence," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. "You are not a pioneer. You are not a martyr fighting against an oppressive corporate system. You stole retirement funds from hardworking people to buy sports cars, and you attempted to steal millions from this corporation to cover your tracks. You are not a victim. You are a thief." Terrence collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, his legs finally giving out completely under the absolute crushing weight of the projected evidence. The wealthy Vanguard executives stared at him with unadulterated contempt and pure absolute disgust. Brittany looked at her husband with sheer horror, realizing she was now married to a destitute, exposed criminal facing decades behind federal bars. Cynthia helplessly watched her golden goose get slaughtered right in front of her face. The cold, undeniable truth of the numbers had completely eradicated their fraudulent reality forever. For a few satisfying seconds, I looked at the executives sitting beside me, their faces etched with severe corporate disdain. Then I shifted my gaze to my father. Edward remained entirely mute during Terrence's brutal dismantling. He sat slumped in his ergonomic chair, praying my forensic wrath would remain focused on his son-in-law. He hoped his own complicity in the $15 million forgery would be overshadowed. He was fatally incorrect. I tapped the screen of my tablet, closing the financial flowchart and opening a simple audio file interface. I informed the Vanguard legal team that while Terrence was stealing their corporate capital, Edward was plotting his own separate escape from the impending federal fallout. I told them my father tracked me down at a coffee shop 24 hours prior, desperately seeking a bailout. Edward physically jolted, snapping his head up to look at me. The sheer panic in his eyes was blinding. He raised his hands, shaking his head frantically, begging me to stop. I pressed play. The high-definition audio recording echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art boardroom speakers. Edward's desperate, raspy voice filled the room, begging for a secret $2 million wire transfer to a non-extradition country. The executives listened in stunned silence as the recording captured Edward explaining his exact plan to charter a private flight to Belize and vanish before authorities flagged his passport. But the most destructive part of the recording was not the evasion of federal prosecution. It was the absolute ruthless betrayal of his own family. The audio played the exact moment I asked Edward what would happen to Cynthia Brittany and Terrence if he fled the country. Edward's recorded voice scoffed bitterly, calling Cynthia a total liability who could not survive without luxury and would only slow him down. He called his golden child Brittany completely brainwashed and explicitly stated that Terrence deserved to take the fall for the entire Ponzi scheme. He loudly declared he was not going down with a sinking ship and needed to save himself. The recording ended, leaving the boardroom engulfed in a heavy, toxic silence. Cynthia sat frozen. The muscles in her face twitched violently as her brain processed the undeniable reality that her devoted husband of over 30 years had just attempted to leave her completely bankrupt to face a federal indictment entirely alone. The illusion of her perfect high society marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces. She slowly turned her head to look at Edward. Her emerald eyes were wide, dark, and burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. Edward shrank back into his leather chair, holding his hands up defensively. He stammered a pathetic excuse, claiming the recording was taken out of context and that he was just experiencing a temporary moment of extreme stress. Cynthia did not say a single word. She let out a guttural, blood-curdling scream that sounded like a wild animal. She lunged across the space between them, completely abandoning every ounce of her carefully cultivated upper-class dignity. She threw herself directly at Edward, her manicured fingernails turning into actual weapons. Cynthia grabbed Edward by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit, violently shaking him back and forth. She slapped him across the face with a resounding crack that echoed off the glass walls. She screamed that he was a disgusting coward, a pathetic failure, and a traitor. She shrieked about all the sacrifices she made to build their social status only for him to try and leave her rotting in a federal prison cell. Edward tried to push her away, yelling for her to calm down, but Cynthia was entirely unhinged. She grabbed his silk tie, physically clawing at his chest. Brittany, watching her parents brawl like common criminals, suddenly snapped out of her own paralyzed shock. The realization that her father had planned to abandon her, coupled with the fact that her husband was a completely broke fraudster, pushed her straight over the psychological edge. She whipped around to face Terrence, who was still slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the table. Brittany slapped Terrence hard on the shoulder, her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life. She shrieked that she was a laughingstock on social media, that her brand new Porsche was repossessed, and that she was now legally tied to a massive federal embezzlement case. Terrence tried to defend himself, raising his voice to argue, but Brittany was absolutely relentless. She yelled she was filing for an immediate divorce. She declared she would testify against him in federal court if it meant saving herself from going to jail. She called him a fake, a liar, and a completely useless failure. The Vanguard executives watched the violent implosion with horrified eyes. This was supposed to be a highly controlled corporate mediation regarding real estate fraud. Instead, their elite boardroom had been transformed into a brutal, chaotic fighting ring. The perfect, affluent family that Cynthia and Edward had spent decades projecting to the world was violently tearing each other apart right in front of the very billionaires they had tried to swindle. It was an ugly display of raw greed, cowardice, and absolute betrayal. I sat perfectly still at the head of the obsidian table, watching the glorious destruction unfold. I did not intervene. I did not call for security. I simply observed the catastrophic collapse of the people who had treated me like a disappointment for my entire life. They had sold my inheritance behind my back, demanded my gratitude, and mocked my career. Now they were screaming, crying, and physically attacking each other, while staring down the barrel of massive federal sentences. The tactical strike was flawlessly executed. The Golden family was entirely destroyed from the inside out, and I had not even broken a single sweat. The violent implosion of my family played out exactly as I had modeled it in my risk assessment. Vanguard Corporation was a financial titan that protected its capital with lethal precision. They did not invite my family to their global headquarters to negotiate a settlement or offer a slap on the wrist. They brought them into this glass fortress to hold them securely in place while the trap snapped shut. The lead Vanguard counsel raised her hand, signaling the security personnel stationed discreetly by the frosted glass doors. She did not say a single word to my screaming mother or my hysterical sister. She simply nodded. The heavy doors glided open, but it was not Vanguard security that stepped into the boardroom. It was a highly coordinated team of federal agents. 4 men and 2 women, dressed in sharp tactical windbreakers, bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission, walked into the room with absolute chilling authority. The physical brawl between Cynthia and Edward instantly ceased. Cynthia froze her hands, still clutching the torn lapels of Edward's ruined suit. Brittany stopped screaming at Terrence, her mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated terror. Terrence physically recoiled, pushing his chair backward until it hit the glass wall behind him, trying desperately to escape the inevitable. A senior FBI agent, a tall, imposing man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. He did not ask for permission to speak. He looked directly at Terrence, pulling a thick, folded warrant from his interior pocket. He announced in a voice that carried the absolute weight of the United States government that he had a federal arrest warrant for Terrence Vance on multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and operating an unregistered investment scheme. Before Terrence could even formulate a pathetic excuse, 2 agents flanked him. They moved with mechanical efficiency, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom sounded like a vault door slamming shut on his entire life. Terrence did not resist. He went completely limp, staring blankly at the floor as his fake billionaire persona was completely eradicated. The senior agent then turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward my father. Edward was already hyperventilating, clutching his chest as the reality of his own confession played back in his mind. The agent informed Edward that he was also being placed under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, document forgery, and accessory to a federal financial crime. Edward burst into loud, pathetic sobs. He fell to his knees on the plush carpet, begging the agents for mercy. He cried that he was a respected businessman, that he had a heart condition, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding orchestrated by his son-in-law. The agents ignored his desperate, pathetic pleading entirely. They hauled him to his feet and slapped the steel cuffs onto his wrists, effectively ending his reign as the arrogant patriarch of Beacon Hill. Cynthia let out a high-pitched wail, reaching out toward Edward not to comfort him but in absolute blind panic. She screamed at the agents, demanding to know who was going to pay the mortgage and how she was supposed to survive if they took her husband away. The SEC agent, a sharp-eyed woman holding a thick clipboard, looked at Cynthia with absolute disdain. She coldly informed my mother that every single bank account, holding company, and financial asset tied to Edward and Terrence had been officially frozen by federal mandate as of 8 o'clock that morning. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her husband and her father being marched toward the boardroom doors in handcuffs. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with betrayal and sheer terror. "You did this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You called them!" I stood up, smoothing my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at my sister, offering her no sympathy and zero apologies. "I forwarded my forensic dossier to the federal authorities 3 days ago, Brittany." I stated, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of emotion. "Vanguard Corporation verified the data and coordinated the arrest. I did not do this to you. Your husband stole millions of dollars to buy you sports cars and diamonds. The bill just finally came due." The agents led Terrence and Edward out of the boardroom, marching them down the long, sterile corporate corridor. Vanguard security escorted Cynthia and Brittany out right behind them, ensuring they were immediately removed from the premises. The timing of the arrest was flawlessly synchronized to inflict maximum psychological damage. It was lunchtime at Vanguard Global Headquarters. As the federal agents perp walked Terrence and Edward through the massive towering glass lobby, hundreds of elite corporate employees, analysts, and executives were returning from their lunch breaks. The entire lobby came to a standstill. Hundreds of people stopped and stared, pulling out their smartphones to record the spectacle. Terrence, the self-proclaimed financial visionary, and Edward, the arrogant real estate tycoon, were paraded past a sea of absolute corporate judgment. They were humiliated, degraded, and entirely exposed to the world. I stood at the massive floor-to-ceiling window in the boardroom, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting down on the street. The Vanguard executives remained seated at the table, watching the aftermath of the tactical strike. The lead counsel turned to me, a faint smile playing on her lips. She remarked that it was a highly efficient extraction. I simply nodded. The surgical removal of the cancer from my life was finally complete. The fraudulent empire was burned to ash, and the true architects of my misery were currently sitting in the back of federal transport vehicles heading straight to processing. I turned away from the window, walking back to the obsidian table. I picked up my tablet, closing the financial files. The familial ties were officially severed forever. I was no longer the quiet, disappointing daughter. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. And as I packed my briefcase, I prepared for the final phase of my ascension. The federal authorities had their prisoners, but Vanguard Corporation still needed my expertise, and I was ready to negotiate my new reality. The week following the spectacular corporate ambush at Vanguard headquarters was a masterclass in federal efficiency. When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation coordinate a joint asset seizure, they do not leave a single stone unturned. The swiftness of the destruction was absolutely breathtaking to witness from the safety of my downtown luxury apartment. Terrence and Edward were formally indicted, denied bail as high flight risks, and locked inside a federal detention center awaiting trial. The government immediately moved to secure any remaining capital to compensate the hundreds of defrauded investors whose retirement accounts Terrence had systematically drained. That meant liquidating the fraudulent empire. The Beacon Hill Mansion, the ultimate symbol of my mother's desperately curated high society identity, was raided early on a Tuesday morning. I read the detailed reports from Dominic, who had connections within the Asset Forfeiture Division. A fleet of moving trucks accompanied by armed federal agents blocked the affluent street. They did not just seize the bank accounts, they stripped the entire property bare. They boxed up Cynthia's imported Persian rugs, her collection of designer handbags, and the glittering crystal chandeliers. They repossessed the remaining luxury vehicles in the driveway. The authorities even cataloged and confiscated Brittany's expensive wedding ring, recognizing it was purchased with stolen investor funds. Cynthia and Brittany were given exactly 2 hours to pack a single suitcase each of basic non-luxury necessities before they were physically escorted off the premises. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate were padlocked and sealed with bright yellow federal warning tape. The wealthy neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress stood on their manicured lawns, watching the humiliating eviction unfold in broad daylight. The social death my mother feared more than anything else in the world was finally complete and absolute. Exactly 7 days after the Vanguard boardroom implosion, the intercom panel in my apartment buzzed loudly. It was a cold, rainy evening. Dominic and I were reviewing a new, highly lucrative consulting contract Vanguard Corporation had just sent over. I walked over to the sleek video monitor mounted on the wall and tapped the screen. The high-definition camera feed displayed the front vestibule of my secure luxury building. Standing there, shivering under the harsh security lights, were 2 women who looked entirely unrecognizable. Cynthia and Brittany looked completely destroyed. Their perfect salon-styled hair was flat and drenched from the autumn rain. They were not wearing their usual cashmere coats or emerald jewels. They wore cheap, ill-fitting jackets and carried basic canvas duffel bags. The pure desperation radiating from them was palpable, even through a digital monitor. I pressed the button to unlock the lobby door, allowing them to take the elevator up to my penthouse floor. I wanted to look them in the eyes for this final closure. I opened my heavy oak front door just as the elevator chimed. Cynthia practically fell out of the elevator. She stumbled toward my doorway, her face gaunt and completely devoid of her usual aggressive makeup. Brittany followed close behind her, dragging a soggy canvas bag, looking like a terrified child. They stopped a few feet from my threshold, entirely stripped of their fake wealth, their arrogance, and their delusional entitlement. "Caroline!" My mother gasped, her voice a weak, raspy shadow of its former commanding tone. "Please, you have to let us in. The feds took absolutely everything. They took the house, they took the cars, they even took my jewelry boxes. The bank accounts are entirely frozen. We do not have a single dollar to our names. We took a public bus to get here." Brittany began to sob loudly, clutching her cheap jacket around her shoulders. "Terrence lied to me," she wailed, fresh tears streaming down her face. "He completely ruined my life. I have nowhere to go, Caroline. My friends will not even answer my calls anymore. You have a massive guest room. You have to let us stay here just until we figure things out. We are your family." I stood in the doorway, blocking their entry. The warm ambient light from my expensive apartment spilled out into the hallway, illuminating their pathetic, drenched figures. They had the absolute audacity to show up at my doorstep, begging for shelter after spending my entire life mocking my career, dismissing my worth, and attempting to steal my multi-million-dollar inheritance to fund their fraudulent crimes. They thought the biological tie between us would somehow override the massive mountain of betrayal they had built. Dominic stepped up behind me, placing a warm, supportive hand on my lower back. He looked at the two women shivering in the hallway with the same cold, professional detachment he reserved for defeated opposing counsel. He did not say a word, allowing me to deliver the final verdict. I looked at my mother, seeing past the rain and the tears straight into the hollow core of her personality. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner just a week ago. I remembered the $50,000 check she threw at me like a scrap of garbage. I remembered the smug, condescending smile on her face when she told me I was a disappointment who did not understand the real world. I crossed my arms over my chest, projecting a wall of absolute freezing indifference. "I am not running a charity shelter for the accomplices of federal criminals," I stated, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet hallway. "You made your choices when you forged that transfer deed. You chose to protect a fraudster instead of your own daughter. You tried to sell my future to buy yourselves a few more years of fake high society status." "Caroline, please," Cynthia begged, dropping to her knees on the cold hallway tile. She actually kneeled before me, clasping her hands together in a desperate, pathetic prayer. "I am your mother. You cannot leave us out on the street. We will do anything. We will clean the apartment. We will earn our keep." Brittany sank down next to her, also kneeling, her face buried in her hands. She was no longer the golden child. She was just a broke accomplice facing a terrifying reality she had zero skills to navigate. I looked down at them kneeling at my feet, exactly where their own greed had placed them. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I felt the profound, satisfying weight of ultimate justice. "You told me I did not know business," I said, articulating every single word with razor-sharp precision. "You said I was just a drone who stared at spreadsheets all day. You said I lacked the aggressive mindset needed for true wealth. But I deal in the business of truth, and the truth is you are completely and utterly bankrupt." I stepped back into my foyer, maintaining eye contact with Cynthia, until the very last possible second. I reached for the heavy oak door and swung it forward. I did not slam it in a fit of rage. I shut it with a firm, controlled, and incredibly satisfying click, locking the deadbolt and sealing them outside in the cold forever. I turned away from the door, leaving them kneeling in the hallway, completely abandoning them to the harsh, unforgiving reality they had built for themselves. I walked away from the heavy oak door, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of my mother crying in the hallway, until the soundproof walls of my penthouse completely absorbed the noise. Dominic was waiting in the living room, holding two heavy crystal glasses filled with vintage scotch. He handed me a glass, tapping the rim against mine with a soft, clear chime. We drank in absolute silence, enjoying the perfect, unblemished peace of a sanctuary that was finally entirely my own. The biological dead weight had been surgically excised from my life. I had no family left, and I had never felt so incredibly wealthy. 3 days later, my professional phone rang. It was not a desperate relative or a panicked lawyer begging for a settlement. It was the executive assistant to Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Corporation. The assistant did not ask for a meeting or request my availability. She politely informed me that a private corporate car was already waiting downstairs to bring me directly to the global headquarters. When I walked through the towering glass lobby of Vanguard this time, I was not a contracted auditor there to clean up a messy crime scene. I was an honored corporate guest. The security personnel who had previously escorted my handcuffed father and brother-in-law out of the building now greeted me by my formal name and swiped me directly into the private executive elevator. The heavy doors opened on the top floor, revealing a sprawling suite enclosed in floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire downtown financial district. The city looked small from up there, entirely mapped out in grids of power and capital. Marcus Thorne was a man who personally commanded billions of dollars in global assets. He was in his early 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the calm, predatory demeanor of a man who rarely heard the word no. He stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk, extending a hand to greet me. He directed me to sit in a plush leather armchair opposite his desk. There were no aggressive lawyers present this time. There were no tense negotiations or federal agents waiting in the wings. It was just the two of us sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the corporate food chain. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair, steepling his fingers together. He did not waste time with pleasantries or awkward apologies regarding the chaotic boardroom incident with my family. Instead, he offered a genuine, highly calculated professional compliment. He told me that in his 40 years in the corporate finance sector, he had never seen an independent auditor dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme with such ruthless surgical precision. He appreciated that I did not let emotional family ties cloud my fiduciary duty to the truth. Vanguard valued absolute integrity above all else, and my flawless performance under extreme psychological pressure had deeply impressed their entire executive board. He opened a sleek leather folder resting on his desk. Marcus stated that despite the massive federal criminal investigation currently consuming my father and Terrence Vanguard's original objective remained completely unchanged. They still desperately wanted to acquire the warehouse district land. The urban gentrification project they were planning was already heavily capitalized, and my grandparents' property was the absolute crucial centerpiece of their commercial development strategy. Marcus looked at me with total transparency, entirely abandoning the standard corporate posturing. He admitted that the initial $15 million offer my father had fraudulently accepted was a severe lowball figure. Edward had been so blinded by his own greed and so desperate to secure the cash to bail out Terrence that he completely failed to understand the actual zoning potential of the real estate. Vanguard was fully prepared to take advantage of his stunning incompetence, but Marcus clarified that they were not going to play those predatory games with me. Marcus slid a crisp legal document across the polished wood of his desk. It was a formal acquisition contract, drafted directly to the Delaware corporate trustee managing my blind trust. The purchase price was clearly printed in bold black ink. $20 million. It was a clean, immediate wire transfer with zero contingencies, zero broker fees, and zero hidden clauses. They were offering the true unvarnished market value of the land, recognizing that they were finally dealing with a financial equal who knew exactly how to read a zoning ledger. I picked up the contract, scanning the clauses with my trained forensic eye. The terms were absolutely flawless, reflecting a deep respect for my legal boundaries. I looked up at Marcus, nodding slowly in approval. I told him I would authorize the trustee to execute the sale immediately upon clearing the funds. But Marcus Thorne was not finished. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a second, distinctly different document. He slid it across the table, placing it right next to the $20 million land acquisition contract. This document had my forensic accounting firm's logo, printed perfectly at the top, right next to the Vanguard corporate seal. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the desk. He explained that a corporation, the sheer size of Vanguard, is constantly under attack from external fraud, internal embezzlement, and highly sophisticated financial scams. He stated that their internal risk management team was exceptionally good, but they fundamentally lacked the merciless predatory instinct he had witnessed in me. He did not just want to buy my land to build a shopping center. He wanted to buy my absolute unyielding loyalty. He offered me a position as Vanguard Corporation's senior anti-fraud consultant. It was an exclusive retainer contract guaranteeing my firm a multi-million-dollar annual payout regardless of the hours billed. In exchange, I would serve as their ultimate apex predator. I would have full autonomous authority to audit their future acquisitions, investigate their executive board members, and tear apart any suspicious financial data before it could threaten the corporation. He was handing me the keys to the corporate kingdom, giving me unprecedented power within one of the largest financial institutions on the planet. I looked down at the two incredibly lucrative contracts resting on the mahogany desk. On my left was a $20 million payout securing my grandparents' legacy and permanently solidifying my personal wealth beyond any reasonable measure. On my right was a multi-million-dollar corporate retainer that instantly elevated my independent accounting firm to the absolute highest tier of the global financial industry. I thought about my mother, Cynthia, who had told me I was a boring spreadsheet drone who would never amount to anything. I thought about Brittany, who mocked my lack of a luxury sports car while driving a vehicle financed by stolen retirement funds. I thought about Edward, who confidently claimed I did not understand real business while he actively committed a massive federal felony. They were currently sitting in holding cells or cheap motels, stripped of their entire fake reality and facing absolute ruin. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the highest office in the city dictating the terms of my own massive financial empire. I reached into my tailored suit jacket, pulling out my heavy silver fountain pen. I uncapped it, placing the fine tip against the thick parchment of the land acquisition contract. I signed my name with sharp, confident strokes. I moved the pen to the consulting retainer, executing my signature on the bottom line. I capped the pen and pushed the executed documents back across the massive desk. Marcus Thorne smiled a genuine shark-like grin, extending his hand across the table once more. We shook hands, sealing a powerful pact built entirely on cold, hard, undeniable facts. The real deal was finally done, and I had won absolutely everything. Exactly 12 months passed since that handshake in the Vanguard executive suite. A single year is a relatively short period of time in the grand scope of a human life, but it is more than enough time to completely balance the scales of justice. The federal court system moved with a swift and brutal efficiency that left my former family entirely decimated. Edward and Terence did not receive the leniency they arrogantly assumed their status would afford them. The audio recording of Edward attempting to flee the country and abandon his accomplices completely shattered any chance he had at securing a plea deal. The federal judge presiding over their case was famously unforgiving toward white-collar criminals who preyed on retirement funds. Edward was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who once sat at the head of a mahogany dining table boasting about his real estate empire now spends his days mopping the linoleum floors of a prison cafeteria. His tailored suits were permanently traded for a standard-issue khaki uniform. Terence received an even harsher sentence. Because his unregistered Ponzi scheme actively defrauded dozens of elderly investors, the judge handed down a staggering 20-year sentence. The charismatic financial visionary who promised his followers private jets and generational wealth is now confined to an 8 by 10-foot concrete cell. His silver tongue and progressive buzzwords are completely useless behind federal bars. The women they left behind did not fare much better. When the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division seized the Beacon Hill mansion, they truly left Cynthia and Brittany with absolutely nothing. They were forced to relocate to a cramped, dingy studio apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The space is so small they have to sleep on a pull-out sofa that entirely blocks the front door when it is unfolded. Cynthia, the former matriarch of high society, who once wore emerald gowns and threw lavish autumn galas, now works 40 hours a week as a cashier at a discount pharmacy. She spends her days scanning cheap cosmetics and bagging cough drops for minimum wage, standing on her feet until her back aches. She has aged a decade in a single year. Brittany experienced an equally harsh collision with reality. Her massive social media following vanished overnight when the truth about her stolen Porsche and diamond necklaces went viral. The internet mob she tried to weaponize against me immediately turned on her, tearing her digital reputation to absolute shreds. Without her fake wealth or her arrogant husband to shield her, Brittany had to get a real job. She currently works the early morning shift as a barista at a chain coffee shop. She spends her days wearing a stained green apron, wiping down sticky counters, and steaming milk for customers who do not care about her past elite status. They are both entirely trapped in a grueling cycle of poverty and manual labor, entirely stripped of their arrogance and their endless entitlement. They have finally learned the true value of a dollar. I did not keep track of their misery out of spite. I only knew these details because the financial news networks simply refused to let the story die. The spectacular implosion of Apex Visionary Capital and the Vanguard Corporation real estate bust became a highly publicized cautionary tale used in corporate training seminars across the country. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my sprawling new Manhattan penthouse, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. The $20 million blind trust payout combined with my massive Vanguard anti-fraud retainer had elevated my life to a level of untouchable freedom. Dominic and I had relocated to the city, purchasing this magnificent property overlooking the glittering skyline. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture with floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek minimalist design. It was a sanctuary built entirely on hard work, absolute integrity, and undeniable truth. Inside the living room, the massive flat-screen television was playing in the background. A prominent financial news anchor was delivering a one-year retrospective on the massive fraud case. The anchor spoke in a serious, dramatic tone, flashing old photographs of Edward and Terrence across the screen, detailing exactly how an independent forensic auditor managed to bring down their entire criminal enterprise in a matter of days. The news program displayed footage of the Beacon Hill mansion being seized and showed clips of Terrence being walked out of the corporate lobby in federal handcuffs. Dominic stepped out onto the balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind him. He looked incredibly handsome in a casual tailored shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He held two crystal flutes filled with expensive vintage champagne. He handed one to me, offering a warm, proud smile that reached his eyes. He gestured with his head toward the television inside the living room. "They are talking about your masterpiece again." He noted, his voice full of quiet admiration. "Do you want me to turn the volume up so we can watch the recap?" I looked through the glass, watching the anchor point to a digital graphic of the Ponzi scheme flowchart I had personally designed. A year ago, the actions of those people had the power to dictate my emotions, to make me feel small or unappreciated. Now they were just pixels on a screen. They were a closed case file. They were absolutely nothing to me. I took a slow sip of the crisp, cold champagne, letting the bubbles dance on my tongue. I shook my head, handing Dominic a small remote control I had resting in my pocket. "No," I said, my voice soft, but entirely resolute. "Turn it off." Dominic aimed the remote through the glass and pressed the power button. The television screen instantly went black, cutting off the news anchor's voice and plunging the living room into a peaceful quiet. The ghosts of Beacon Hill were permanently extinguished. I turned my back to the dark television and walked to the edge of the balcony, resting my hands against the cool metal railing. I looked out over the endless glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline, stretching out into the vast horizon. Millions of stories were playing out in the city below, but the only one that mattered to me was the one I was actively writing. I felt Dominic step up behind me, wrapping his arms securely around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. I smiled, breathing in the crisp night air, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. The heavy burdens of my past were gone. My real life had just begun. The most powerful lesson from Caroline's story is that cold, hard facts will always outlast loud, arrogant manipulation. Toxic individuals often weaponize guilt gaslighting and social pressure to maintain control, assuming their targets will fold under emotional blackmail. However, Caroline demonstrates that true power lies in silent preparation and verifiable truth. She never stooped to their level of screaming or public mudslinging. Instead, she simply let their own lies dismantle their empire. When facing manipulators, your greatest defense is unshakable integrity. Protect your peace, stand your ground, and share your own experiences with toxic relatives in the comments below.